Hello and welcome to AWANI Global. I am Fana Sheh. Now, in 2024, nearly 300 million people around the world will need humanitarian assistance and protection due to conflicts, climate emergencies, and other drivers. Now, the world is experiencing more conflicts which are more entrenched with devastating consequences to the civilians, but the global climate change, global climate emergency is exacerbating the situation a bit further. Now, with us today is Alexander Matheou, Regional Director for Asia Pacific of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, to talk more about this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Right. Now, I understand IFRC has done a lot of work on the ground when it comes to humanitarian assistance. We would like to know, for 2024, what will be some of the major humanitarian challenges in the Asia-Pacific region that will be of priority, as well as the risks that they posed?
Well, sadly, the top challenges for 2024 are likely to be the same challenges we experienced in 2023 and 2022. And that is that within Asia Pacific, we have a small number of protracted crises that are affecting large numbers of people. And you can guess what they are: Afghanistan, Myanmar, the refugee situation in Bangladesh. These are complex emergencies that are caused by a combination of man-made and climate issues. They've been going on for a long, long time, and there is no obvious end in sight. That has resulted in all three cases in quite a large dependence on humanitarian assistance, whether that's coming from neighbors or whether it's coming from abroad. And that is likely to remain the same. And our challenge is there around how to provide long-term assistance to people that is ultimately economically empowering rather than making them dependent on aid. On top of that, like in 2023, we're likely to face accelerating climate risk because we are now in a long emergency of climate change. We're responding to around 2 climate emergencies a month at the moment in Asia Pacific, largely flooding, but there are many other types of climate crises as well. And then, of course, there are the big unknowns. We don't know exactly what is ahead of us. We may face another major climate event like we saw in Pakistan with the flooding. We may see a major earthquake. Of course, we hope not. And of course, there are man-made issues that are on the horizon, which we don't know how they will unfold in the South China Sea and the Korea Peninsula. So there are unknowns, and there are some things that we are quite confident we will stay engaged in.
Right. I understand, your organization obviously has been on the ground and looking at all these humanitarian issues and climate change emergencies. What are some of the challenges that you encounter in these areas that are worth highlighting, you feel?
Well, the challenges are quite varied because each context is specific and each context has a differing capacity to cope. Observing or supporting how a disaster is responded to in Japan is going to be very different from responding to an earthquake in Afghanistan. Or seeing a cyclone in Bangladesh is not the same as seeing a cyclone in a small island states of the Pacific. So it is very context specific. Nevertheless, in all cases, we do know that if there is good preparedness in place, if there are trained volunteers, if there are good early warning systems, if there are pre-positioned stocks, if there are protocols about where people need to go to be safe in times of a crisis, we're likely to see low levels of mortality. If we do not have those things in place, we're likely to see more people hurt and even losing their lives. So there are context-specific issues around Asia-Pacific, as you would imagine. Some of the best examples in the world about disaster preparedness are from the Asia-Pacific region, but there are also places of high risk.
Right. I guess drawing on to that, looking at, like you said, some of the best disaster preparedness is in the Asia-Pacific. What are usually key priorities that your organization would look at in ensuring that adequate and efficient humanitarian responses in this region?
Well, it does vary a little bit, but some of the common themes we would look for are there strong early warning systems? Is there a way of informing people in time that they need to move to an area of safety? Because improvements in that area have had a massive impact on loss of life in times of disaster in the Asia-Pacific region. And perhaps a particular example for that is Bangladesh, where 20, 30 years ago, the number of people who lost their lives in cyclones and flooding due to cyclones and floods was significant. And now the damage is still significant, but the loss of life is very low. There is an issue about infrastructure, particularly around earthquakes. We saw an earthquake in Japan recently. The fact that the infrastructure was resilient made a huge difference to loss of life. Compare that to the earthquake in Afghanistan, where mud and brick houses collapsed onto people's heads at the first tremor. The infrastructure makes a huge difference. So it's a combination of factors: saves lives or creates risk. If you have good early warning and good protocols about how and where to go to stay safe, that will reduce risk. If you have resilient infrastructure, that will reduce risk. If you have neither, there is high risk.
Right. So it seems like a combination of, already present infrastructure in the country, for example, and also, additional humanitarian assistance that you bring in, that your organization bring in. Right. There is another factor that we are always looking at now, which is the global climate crisis that also exacerbate this situation, right? So worldwide, natural disasters and climate change are undeniably among the most significant threats to humanity's future and major drivers of humanitarian crisis today. So what are the key lessons that you feel you learned from 2023, and how did your organization navigate this ever-changing humanitarian landscape when all of this is factored in?
Well, the number of disasters is significantly increased compared to the past, which is a good, strong evidence that we are living in a long emergency of climate change now. The frequency of such risks has a big impact on how the humanitarian system responds, because its ability to respond simultaneously at the same time in many different places is limited. So if 10 years ago there were a major cyclone in the Philippines, for example, and it hit the world news, and global solidarity and regional solidarity from neighbors meant that large amounts of assistance could be provided to the Philippines to protect lives and livelihoods. That is no longer the case. The fact that there are multiple conflict crises as well as climate crises happening in the world at the same time mean that disasters, even if they are of a significant magnitude, are not receiving the attention or the support that they once did. And that means key things for us. It means that more than ever, the preparedness and the capacity to respond has to be at a local and a national level, because the international community will only step in for real major events. So a lot of emphasis now is on ensuring that, in our case, in every country in the world, there is a strong Red Cross or Red Crescent society able to be the first community-based responder to every man-made and natural disaster, and that they can do that as independently as possible with as little external support as possible. And that means that the international support will really surge in for the major crises when national capacity is overwhelmed. Of course, it's not just down to the Red Cross or Red Crescent societies. They are part of a much bigger response structure, primarily led by the government, but we hope we can play a significant part.
Right. I mean, I want to talk more about the support that you said just now, from international community or even neighboring countries. But before that, I want to look at, Asia Pacific in narrowing it down as a region that remains, very prone to the highest category for disasters and climate risks. We've seen typhoons, we've seen, even here in Malaysia, we've seen flooding, yearly now. So what could be, forecasting in 2024, what could be some of the major humanitarian challenges for Asia Pacific in general?
Well, the things that we're quite confident that we will see are in places increased rainfall and flooding. The global warming does increase the likelihood of cyclones and typhoons. Cities are particularly susceptible to heat waves, which are particularly difficult for older people and smaller children, or people living with chronic health issues. Those are things that we need, and that can also result in prolonged drought and extreme weather events, such as we're seeing in Mongolia at the moment, of extreme cold spells, which have a significant impact on livelihoods because of loss of livestock. So those things we are quite confident we are going to see more of. What is harder to predict is the major events major flooding. And of course, what is even harder to predict are the earthquakes, because there is no early warning system for earthquakes. We know where the risks are, but we don't know when they will strike or at what magnitude they will strike. So there's always an element of unknown, but where we can be prepared is for the seasonal risks, which are happening every year, but with greater severity, and the severity of them is more frequent than in the past. But we are in unknown territory. You will remember that last year we saw people swept down the streets of Hong Kong. You don't see those things normally. So dramatic, unexpected events are happening, but we can at least try to be better prepared for the seasonal risks, which we are aware of.
Yeah, I mean, when you outline it like that, it seems like the future is quite bleak, but at the same time, the level of preparedness and organization like yourself, are there to support and are there to prepare these countries for this kind of unexpected events. So we're lucky for that, at least. Now, talking about support here, funding, is a key issue in ensuring delivery of aid and services. With more humanitarian crises now underlined, more climate disaster risks, and like you said just now, attention shifting when it comes to prioritizing which disaster we're looking at. So what can you say about the financial responsibility coming in from various stakeholders, be it international community, neighboring countries, stakeholders, when it comes to funding for humanitarian assistance?
Yeah, that's a very important question to us. But if I may, just on your previous point, it is what you said about it as a good news and a worrying story at the same time. It is very true, because on most indicators of quality of life, we are safer than we have ever been. But that doesn't mean that we should be complacent about the risks that we face. And the fact that we do support each other in times of crisis is also something that we should consider good news. In the Asia-Pacific region, the largest population movement was in 2017 when the Rohingya moved out of Myanmar into Bangladesh. Now, when hundreds of thousands of people cross a border in a matter of days with nothing, if that had happened in any other period in our history, probably many of them would have died from diseases, from thirst, from hunger. And in this particular case, once they crossed the border, and the government of Bangladesh decided that they would accept them and provide them protection, and the humanitarian system scaled up very quickly in terms of shelter, food, water, etc. Very few lost their lives at that point. So there is something to celebrate, as well as something to be worried about in terms of how we are responding to these crises. In terms of how we will finance the response in the future, it is an important point, because what we have seen over the last 50 years is that a global rescue system or a global humanitarian system has emerged, which means that pretty much in any part of the world, if you experience an earthquake or a dramatic natural disaster, or if you are unfortunate enough to live in a country affected by conflict, there is a high likelihood that the humanitarian system is trying to get to you. And there's also a high likelihood that it will get to you at some point and provide some form of assistance, albeit imperfect in many cases, and albeit that some crises get more assistance than others. That system is now under threat because it has been supported primarily by a small number of loyal donors for the past decades. And they are all stretched and giving a little bit less and giving disproportionately to some contexts and less to others, which means that contexts such as Bangladesh, which received a lot of generous support in 2017, are now receiving less. Now, that is a significant issue, and you can feel that in Malaysia and in other places, because the worse the security gets in Bangladesh, the worse the living conditions get in the camps, the more people that will leave, the more people will get on boats, the more people will lose their lives because of dangerous migration routes. It's all interconnected. So the question is, will that global humanitarian safety net that comes in at the start end of an emergency to provide basic support, will it be able to continue to do what it does in the future if it doesn't change its financial architecture? And here, Asia Pacific is key, because if Asia Pacific, with its successful economic growth in many countries, if it contributes more, if it becomes part of that global humanitarian system, that really enables assistance to reach any part of the world when it's needed, then there is more hope that that emergency response capacity will be maintained. If it doesn't, then there is more skepticism. So all eyes on China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia even, who may be able to contribute more.
The important role of neighboring countries, the countries that you mentioned just now, which are just nearby us, within the region in shaping the outcome of, the humanitarian landscape in 2024?
Well, it's partly financial, as I just said. So the more that they contribute, either bilaterally or to the multilateral system, then more assistance will arrive. But of course, a neighbor has more responsibility than that. If you look at the situation in Myanmar, the delivery of assistance will depend on the government of Thailand supporting cross-border support, or India or China. And we're pleased to see the initiative coming from the government of Thailand to support more bilateral aid into Myanmar. We need to see more of that. And there is, of course, that there is usually some form of political pressure that can be applied by neighboring countries on peace processes. And ultimately, for the chronic protracted crisis, it all comes down to that. If there is peace, there is hope for development, economic independence, and thereby a reduced need for humanitarian support. While there is conflict, instability, fragmentation in the country, the vulnerability is high and the need for aid is high. So the responsibilities of neighbors are partly financial, partly access, but perhaps most critically is the political pressure towards peace.
Right. If you don't mind me adding to that, the state of the humanitarian landscape right now, it seems that there are a lot more, it's ever changing. There's a lot more unexpected things happening, disaster, climates, and also shifting attention. When you mentioned Bangladesh just now, from the situation in 2017 to now, it's very different. Do you think there are enough awareness of this kind of shifting landscape when it comes to humanitarian scene, and is there enough people addressing it within the Asia-Pacific region?
I think it would be probably wrong to say there is no awareness.
Yeah.
But whether there's enough political appetite to engage in durable solutions, that's perhaps got more a question mark over it, because the situations are genuinely complex. If you are a Rohingya displaced into Bangladesh, you may want to go home, but it may well not be safe for you to go home. If you are the government of Bangladesh, you might feel it's very politically difficult to host a displaced population indefinitely, especially if the host community is resenting it. And yet, if you push them back, you are committing a great violation of human rights. If you let them stay, it's very politically expensive for you to do so. And therefore, you end up with no solution, because people are waiting for an opportunity for when the conditions are better for a solution that they want. These things are hard to solve. But in the case of Myanmar, in case of the displacement from Myanmar, it does come down to political solutions at the end, not humanitarian solutions. So we should emphasize the importance of humanitarian aid as a form of solidarity, moral support, obligation to fellow human beings, but we should never look at it as a solution.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a lot of these cases are protracted, and it's been going on. It's ongoing still right now. And I think, emphasizing on the need for humanitarian assistance is definitely key here in order for situations to not get any worse. So, right. So I guess on that point, we want to look at those people who are affected by these crises. What message do you have for the local community living in disaster-prone areas across the region? How can they stay informed? How can they be prepared and be connected to the support they need in case they face this kind of potential disasters? Because as you said, it can happen to anyone, anytime, anywhere. So, yeah.
That's right, and therefore the need for preparedness, our own preparedness for ourselves and our families, is greater than ever. And of course, it's hardest of all to prepare for the totally unexpected, because You don't know what's coming. If you do live in an area that is prone to flooding, then it is a little, usually the wisdom is there about when it's going to happen, what you need, where you need to go to stay safe, how you need to protect your livelihoods. It is a case of listening to the early warning. It does come now, usually for floods, sufficiently early for you to take the precautionary measures necessary to stay safe. So if you live in an area like that, then make sure you're connected to the early warning and that you do take that early warning seriously, even if it doesn't give you 100% assurance that something's going to happen, because usually it's a percentage, it's a likelihood. It's a likelihood that there'll be excessive rains rather than an absolute guarantee. But you should take the precautionary measures. Other than that, each of us can know first aid. We can know what the local risks are, know how to protect ourselves and our loved ones. And if early warning information does come in, know what to do. If you're in an earthquake, you know when to get under the table or when to leave the building. If it's a flood, you know when to go to higher ground, etc. These types of basic knowledge can save your life and your loved ones' lives, and it's our responsibility, all of our responsibility, to know those basic life-saving facts.
Definitely. I think the key message that I can take out from the interview so far is always be prepared. Not just, as a state who has the infrastructure, the stakeholders, the management when it comes to, dealing with humanitarian disasters, climate disasters, but also ourselves, making sure that we know basic skills in order to survive, this kind of catastrophic events. So, yeah. That's definitely, I'm going to put in my note there, be prepared always. Right. Before,
no first aid.
Yes, no first aid, definitely. Okay, before we end this, I would like to ask, on behalf of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, how can we as a society help more of what you do, basically support the work that you do?
Well, I would actually say the main thing is be a curious and compassionate citizen with empathy, because many of the root causes of vulnerability that exist in the world are somehow related to social exclusion and stigma. Not all of them, of course, but we are living in an era where there is massive population movements and migration. And for many of the people who do take a desperate decision to abandon their homes and their loved ones in order to go somewhere else where they may be able to send help back home or be safer, their dangerous decision makes them very vulnerable, and even more vulnerable if it encounters hostility and aggression as they move or as they try to build a new life. And being compassionate about where people are coming from and why is important for our collective well-being. Recognizing that the root causes of people's need to move and their vulnerability are often related to climate development issues or conflict, and trying to be a citizen that recognizes that and votes in governments that try to promote peace, that invest in climate resilience, and have a vision for the future and for a safer world for yourselves and your neighbors. That's another way that we can try to be good citizens to increase the likelihood of a safer world. And then as individuals, beyond the way that we behave in terms of how we vote and how we treat each other, there are always opportunities to either give time, give money, give blood, that just enable local organizations to help people in crisis with that extra support, whether that's the Red Cross or any other organization that's trying to help their neighbors at home or abroad.
Yeah, I mean, definitely true. Being compassionate is one thing, but also, I guess, understanding some of these conflicts yourself, right? Taking the time to educate yourself and learning about these conflicts. And, the stuff that you mentioned just now with massive displacement because of climate, I'm not sure, people are keen to take the time to actually know all this sort of information, but it's good that we have, Alexander, yourself as a representative to be on this kind of show and to educate all of us on all this information. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Right.
Thank you for having me.
Right. I think that's all the time we have for now. Thank you so much, Alexander, for joining us. I'm Fana Sheh. Thank you for watching.